Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your attendance to today's program. I am Denis Moura, Gallery 400's Public Program Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to our conversation with Bethany Collins and Sampada Aranke, two practitioners whose works are significant to our understanding of embodiment and race. And before we start, I'd like to call into relation to the land many of us are on today, the broader city of Chicago, named after the Algonquin name for the river whose shores were lined with wild leeks, was and continues to be an indigenous place. Owing to the multiple waterways that converge here, Chicago is the ancestral home of the Three Fires Confederacy, consisting of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, in addition to Miami, Illinois, Inuka, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. The American Indian Center in Albany Park, which was founded in 1953 in the era of relocation, remains to be the oldest urban Indian center in the country. I hope to not merely acknowledge the land we are upon as a performative gesture, but also to invite us to call into relation these lands, histories, and nations. They've not ceased to exist. We also acknowledge the significant work that Gallery 400 and UIC has yet to do in honoring these relations and rectifying this colonial present with other struggles. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us. Those native to this land, indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who've come here by force or otherwise as a result of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and ongoing wars. When we enter any room, even or especially virtual rooms, we must bring these histories into view. With this knowledge, we enter and we meet here in hopes of making a different world. I also encourage you all to please check out Enrich Chicago's list of Indigenous-led land back and reparations project, which you can find in the group chat. So for today's conversation, we are again joined by Sampada Aranke and the artist Bethany Collins. And our conversation is framed around the embodied actions present in Bethany Collins' practice. In her work like Too White to Be Black, which is on view at our current exhibition, Young, Gifted, and Black, the Lumpkin Bakutsi Family Collection of Contemporary Art, Bethany works with language to spell out the personal and historical references that structure racial Blackness. Her mark-making techniques, ones that are built upon writing and erasing, display a frustration, or even more, a curiosity in playing in the ways we see, read, and interpret text. In her essay titled Against Interpretation, Susan Sontag once suggested that interpretation must itself be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. It is a liberating act. It is a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping a dead past. Interpretation takes the sensorial experience of the work of art for granted and proceeds from there. The there that I see in Bethany's work takes us to a place of signification. It is where we find her fingerprints and movement of palms indexed on paper with charcoal and graphite. It's also where we get suspended in an understanding of what it means to be American in her revisitation and revisions of the patriotic America, my country tis to thee, sorry. A work she will discuss. Tonight, Bethany and Sam will take us to a place where interpretation is acquainted with dissecting the authority of language and the ways that it's used to make sense of our world and ourselves as well. So about our speakers tonight, Bethany Collins lives and works in Chicago, Illinois. She received an MFA from Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, and a BA from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Upcoming and recent solo and museums exhibitions include presentations at the Frisk Art Museum, Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, CAM St. Louis, the University of Kentucky Art Museum, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Upcoming and recent program exhibitions include presentations at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, Speed Art Museum, Zimmerli Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art at Chicago, the Renaissance Society, Peabody Essex Museum, Seattle Art Museum, the Phillips Collection, and the Smart Museum, among many others. Her work is also included in the public collections of the Birmingham Museum of Art, Block Museum of Art, Morgan Library and Museum, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Davidson College, University of Chicago, among many other universities and important collections of art. About Sam Aranke, she is an assistant professor in the Art History, Theory and Criticism Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her research interests include performance theories of embodiment, visual culture, and Black cultural and aesthetic theory. Her work has been published in eFlux, Art Forum, Art Journal, ASAP Journal, October, and Transcripts, an interdisciplinary online journal in the humanities and social science at UC Irvine. She has written catalog essays for Sadie Barnett, Rashid Johnson, Faith Ringgold, Kambui Olujimi, Sebo Elise Smith, Zachary Fabry. She is also the recipient of the 2021 Art Journal Award for her article, Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes. And she's currently working on her book manuscript entitled Death Sweet Charity, The Visual Life of Black Power. After the discussion, I encourage you all to use the chat or the raise hand function to pose and post your questions. And now please join me in welcoming Sam Aranke and Bethany Collins with a round of applause.
It's really nice to be here. Sam, it's nice to be in conversation with you this evening. Yes, thank you for the lovely introduction. I think I'm going to show some images first. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's hope it works after 2 years of Zooming. Can you see this? That's the wrong page, but it does work. No? Does that look right?
Yeah, we're good. We can see
it looks good. Okay, so I wanted to start with one of the first language-based works that that the rest of my practice seems to keep unfolding out of. So language is the subject and primary material of my practice. It remains that way since these first early works from the White Noise series. It's also a way that I found it's a kind of prism through which to interrogate any other topic. And at least for the last 4 or 5 years, that that main theme within my practice has been about American history and what does it mean to be American now, and what does it mean to have faith in this place or a sense of identity. And also being Southern, what does it mean to love a place that doesn't always love you back? And I think that can be, larger metaphor for the rest of the country as well. But the first time that language enters my practice is with the White Noise series. So this is actually a precursor to the work that's in the show and also in the collection, Bernard's collection. But the White Noise series started when I was in grad school. I was making very grad school kind of work about race and identity. And it was leading to these very awkward conversations that were less about the work itself and more about the asker, the questioner's attempt to understand something about my own racial makeup and identity and how I identified. And so I was making paper bag pieces. It was about the paper bag test and colorism. And the critique I got was, well, don't you think your work is a little elitist because I don't know that history? Or maybe if you make the paper bag into a slave ship, then I would get that it's about race. Or I can't critique this work because I just don't see color. These very questions or statements that I didn't want to actually enter my work. And so I needed to find a way to exhume them, to expel them from my own obsessive preoccupation. And so I started to take those questions. In this case, the statement was too white to be Black, and write that thing over and over and over again. First across the back of the chalkboard in that punishing kind of text, write it until you learn your lesson that way. And then that gets semi-erased. And on top of that, background text, the cursive kind of illustrative text, what looks like snowflakes or land masses or weather formations, celestial skies. It takes on all different forms, but they're actually the same statement kind of deconstructed into just tiny letters. So the small little white charcoal that you're seeing is actually the same statement, too white to be Black, written over and over and over again. This is also the first time that abstraction enters my practice. And so in order to have some sort of limitation for how long one can obsess on this particular language and finding a kind of natural death for the work, that there is a natural end to it, The limitation became I'll write it until my hand hurts, and then I just have to be done. And so the form is both an attempt to solve the problem of the initial statement, right? I'm not a good first responder. So if I can obsess on it and write it 100 times and deconstruct it visually, then it also gives me a long moment to mentally obsess on that language and figure out what I should have said in response to that question. And figure out a response so that I don't make 100 little slave ships in order to satisfy the speaker rather than what I'm attempting to do in the work, right? And also to call it white noise and make fun of the speaker. It did that for me as well. It took problem and made it beautiful. There's still residue of language that, all of these things are still threads throughout the rest of my practice in some way or another. And something about illegibility and frustrating the speaker, that can I take what is frustrating to me about language that doesn't always feel inclusive, that there's some sort of problem within the text. Can I transfer that frustration back onto the viewer and just, and be done with it? All of those are threads, and they continue up until the more recent work. This is one of the first works that I made after the 2016 presidential election, America Hymnal. It's based on 100 versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee that were written from the 18th to 20th centuries. So My Country 'Tis of Thee and a lot of other patriotic songs, and also just folk songs, popular songs of the day, early American songbooks are full of contrafactum. So these are songs that keep the melody consistent. So the melody to My Country 'Tis of Thee, but the lyrics then get rewritten, in this case, at least 100 times for different social and political causes that kind of reveal the chronological span of American history. So there are labor versions, suffrage, prohibition, temperance, lots of prohibition and temperance. Because I think you can tell what we are obsessed on collectively by how many times the song gets rewritten in support of that thing, right? But then there's also Confederate versions and abolitionist versions. The song gets traded back and forth between the Union and the Confederate armies. And it continues on until 20th century, so late 1900s is the final version that I could find. I think there's an audio on the next page. What follows, what's inside of that text is really similar to this hymnal as well, is a burning away of the musical notation. So that's all that's left, right? The music is the only thing that was holding these 100 versions of what it means to be American together. That's gone. And all that's left is 100 differing lyrical versions of what it means to be American. The residue remains, both in, so that the book is laser cut, the hymnal's laser cut. You can laser cut about 10 pages at a time without setting the book on fire. I say this with experience. Set the book on fire after like 11 pages. But that the burning both, it forces, it cuts the musical notes and the staff lines away, but the small kind of, as the laser cuts through 10 pages, it kind of decreases as it goes through the hymnal. And so the way that the small fragments cling to the page differs, the scorch marks differ across the page. If the hymnal is closed for a long time and then reopened, it's not a very pleasant smell. It starts off smelling like a campfire, and then you close it and open it, it's really acrid. It's not pleasant. And so that residue of the violence of language kind of remains in the text and also becomes unsingable. And I think that's something, those kind of threads that you can see in the White Noise series, in the Too White to Be Black piece that is actually in the show, that the residue of language it's a fantasy that you could ever get rid of it. It will always cling to its surface and its essence. I wanted to show you, tell me if you can hear this. It's just an audio piece of a newer work that came from the Star Spangled Banner hymnal, and it's just an excerpt from it.
Oh, say, can you see by freedom's clear light a stain on the banner that's over you flying, which enshrouds the bright stars in the blackness of night, and proclaims to the world that your liberty's dying.
So the audio work was actually installed at the Speed Museum recently for the show around Breonna Taylor's life. And in the work, there are 8 abolitionist versions of the Star Spangled Banner. They're sung in a minor key. So they drop from this like bombastic battle song to mournful kind of dirge, like a mournful version of the anthem. And then one of those versions plays at the end of every hour. So both I think the entire work is about endings and a kind of way to mourn the end of things. In this case, I think, the red hymnal is based on a shape note hymnal. It's a really early American form of singing. The blue hymnal actually looks like the Presbyterian hymnal that I grew up with. And so it is this kind of intermingling of faith, of a kind of secular faith or faith in a place that doesn't always work out. The blue works also come from the Star Spangled Banner, these new panel works. They're really similar to the first white noise pieces and the black noise piece that's in the show. They are, though, based on versions of the Star Spangled Banner that are written from the 18th again to the 20th century. So these contrafactum. And then I'm excerpting, the first white noise pieces where I was trying to figure out some sort of like personal response to very personal language. I ended that series when it felt like I was just getting more and more obsessed with it rather than putting it back out into the world. I was just too preoccupied. And so it felt like it needed to come to an end. But the process is still really interesting for me. And so I wanted to find a way to bring that back into the practice. So for each of these, there'll be 10 blue panels eventually. Each will be based on a different version or contrafactum of the Star Spangled Banner. And the text that I'm rewriting here obsessively, again, it's an excerpted lyric from each of those songs. And the lyric has to feel as though it is a romanticization of some sort of poeticization of violence, right? That these battle songs that romanticize fighting in support of, that to be patriotic requires some sort of violence. That's what I was looking for. But that to sing it and to make it beautiful and poetic means that we're romanticizing something that maybe shouldn't be. It's some sort of play between, the poetry and horror, poetry and violence. They're much more chaotic than the original white noise pieces, I'm hoping. Yeah, I think they are. And they also intermingle the two. So the white noise piece that we looked at the beginning and the black noise piece that's in the show, both of those are visible here. It's white and black noise text. White noise is like TV static. Black noise is actually pure silence. And so it's the song that cannot be sung and therefore cannot make us feel like we belong together in this place. And the song fails on another realm. A couple more series. So these are all works that are after the 2016 election, so all new, and about a kind of national identity. So these works are based on classified ads that were placed in, I think, about 6 African-American newspapers right before the end of the Civil War, all the way up until the 1920s. So formerly enslaved people looking for their loved ones. 1864, 1863, all the way up until the 1920s. Some people would post, it's a one-off, a kind of sending a love letter out into the world in hopes of being reunited with your family. Other times, families or family members would post, on an annual basis, and that search continued. They would include the classified ads. There's a detail on the right, everything that one could remember about your family member, right? So names, given names, but also multiple nicknames, because depending on who you're asking and who might know something, they might know a different name, right, of you in the world. Identifying marks, any kind of, maybe a scar on your cheek or your leg or something. The place you last lived, any plantation, masters, owners' names, all of that was included. Everything that you could remember about your loved one in one small classified ad. The ads, not everybody could read at the time, not everyone was getting the newspaper, and so a lot of times they would also be read from the pulpit as a way of attempting to reunify families. I made this piece after the family separation crisis at the border. They're blind embossed, so the text is engraved into an acrylic plate, And then the paper is soaked, it's run under the printing press. That wet, malleable paper is forced into the grooves of the engraved text. And when you lift the paper up, the text now is like a braille, right? But still English and legible. It protrudes from the surface. So it has that ghost-like haunting quality. It's there and it's not there at the same time. The works are all falling apart because I completed that process twice. So the blind emboss process is repeated as a kind of, we keep repeating the same kind of violent acts against family members, separating family over time as a way of enforcing control of people. And the paper doesn't hold up the second time. It falls apart in different ways. And so they each act as a kind of individual love letter to the one that you have lost. What I like about this work, though, is that once the paper re-dries, though it looks really fragile, it's actually much stronger than it appears. Like it's a solid piece of paper again, and it won't continue to fall apart. The works are grouped according to how people would ask. So all of these are information wanted, was what people would post at the top of their classified ads. Others were, do you know them? Have you seen her? I last saw him in Mississippi. Can you help me to find my people? Which is also the title of a really wonderful book by Heather Williams, where this scholarship comes from, and all of this effort to digitize the ads also kind of emerges out of. These, I think, are still my favorite works. So in 2017, Emily Wilson is the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English. And she gets all these questions in interviews. Oh, what do we need? Another translation of the Odyssey. And she's like, did you ask the 60 men before me that question, right? 60 translations of the Odyssey. And she points to the first line of the Odyssey as one reason for the need for a new translation, her translation. And it's the line where polytropous is the word that is being translated at least 36 distinct ways in all of these previous translations prior to hers. And it's an attempt, that adjective polytropous is an attempt to give us a sense of who is this man. Describe Odysseus for us before we follow you on this really long, incredibly wordy text as he ventures home. Give me a sense of who is this man. And so before Emily Wilson, that word has been translated positive, negative. He's a hero, adventurous, mischievous, crafty, cunning, shifty, just a man. She finally says, he was a complicated man. It's like, yes, embody all the 36 before you in one word, because he is no one way. So he does some things really well, and he is also responsible for everyone in his crew being lost at sea or lost in some sort of other violent act. He's the only one who makes it home, right? He's a complicated man. It's a really complicated place, right? As metaphor. And so I'm looking specifically at book 13, when Odysseus finally gets home, finally reaches his homeland. It's a really long book. After 10 years at war, 10 years weeping on every wrong shoreline he lands on, he finally reaches his own shoreline, looks around and doesn't recognize the place. And that felt like a really good metaphor for that post-election moment, that a place can feel simultaneously familiar and estranging and foreign. And that sense of homeland and exile being about the same place, that you can feel both of those things about the same place, was really satisfying. It was a really satisfying metaphor for me. The process for these works is that the text from each of those translations is reprinted, photo transfer onto separate sheets. And then I rewrite the text over that in graphite so that it becomes physical to me. And then I use a bit of spit and erase everything but opposing translations. Because the other part of the work is that 400 years, you would think this text is settled law, or at least that as Odysseus is looking out at the water, we would know what the water was doing, and we don't. There is no agreement in the text. In this case, the translation, the years are listed in the title, and so these are two different translations, two very different decades. On the left, the translation of the same Greek is, what land is this? What people? What men are born here? Versus, what country, what land is this? Who are the people that dwell in it, right? What men are born here and who are the people who dwell here? It's a very different question to give us a sense of who belongs in this place, but they come from the same Greek. They come from the same origin text. And I find that contradiction embedded in the language, embedded in the text itself, really interesting and still really generative for me. I think that's why these are still my favorites so far. And then just to give you a sense of the process, spit is a little bit more acidic than water. So it eats at the top surface of the page. And so what looks illegible is actually the kind of disintegration of the paper itself, leaving only the contradictions to just forever abide one another in tension. That's what I want. I want them to be tense so I don't have to be. I think we could end there and talk some questions, Sam, if that sounds good. Yes. How do I stop share? Here we go. Yes.
Thank you, Bethany. That was so fantastic. I'm so grateful and humbled to be here. And thank you to Denis and Lorelei for gathering us, and for everyone who's like logging in. I feel like there's like a mini reunion, and I'm so grateful to see old friends and new ones. I have some questions, and I thought maybe we could, get started and then really just keep it open, or trying to keep it as organic as possible for folks to jump in. And Bethany, if you want to ask, we can kind of keep it where we want to go. So I feel like, Denis, this is like a match made in heaven. And I cannot believe that Bethany and I are like in the same zip code, basically, and have never just crossed paths in this way. So I'm really trying to control my glee. But I kind of maybe want to work backwards a little bit, because I'm so there's such a dynamic attention in your work to this relationship between the embodied and the conceptual, or the kind of like, the sensorial or fleshly elements, and the linguistic, the attention to language, and in a kind of like white Western, especially art historical model, we think of those things as like opposed or like diametrically in conflict with each other. And we know that those, as like good feminists, and like all the Black feminists in the world have taught us, those distinctions like fall apart, right? And I'm curious to know, in your practice, your like, even just in that beginning, that first image you showed us, like the score that you've created for yourself is to write this thing with your hand until you physically can't do it anymore, right? It's not that you're mentally like exhausted from it. It's that you're physically exhausted from it. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know like how that embodied response, like I could just imagine your hand cramping and like, all of these kinds of elements of your contortion being like all fucked up. And I'm curious to know like how that embodied knowledge reshapes, or maybe like clarifies or brings something new to you that you hadn't, anticipated or thought of in the work, and then how you fold that into this kind of, not just materially, but maybe also conceptually.
Mm. Oh, I'm gonna like this conversation. I think, I feel like I can answer it so many ways. I needed a way to end the work, and there is something about the part of the work that excites me a lot is the idea, especially these days. It is not the making. And so in order to give value to the work, this feels like a therapy response. In order to give value to the work, I needed to find some sort of physical manifestation, like some sort of thing that would give it a sense of labor. Mm. Yeah. Because the work for me, I could think about it and be happy enough, but it has to exist in the world. And so part of it is, if I write it until my hand hurts, then it has value. That pain becomes necessary for the work to be worthy of being in the world. That's the early work. I'm moving away from that, I hope, because I don't want the necessity of pain to be, I don't want that to be a necessity for the work anymore. Yes. Yeah.
No.
Oh, but then the other part of it is when I can talk about the work, I know that I understand it, but language for me, so I know that I'm explaining the work because I've had a lot of time to like obsess on it. I know that it makes sense now, but for me, that language actually starts off as problem. It doesn't make sense to me. Something in the text or something that someone has said to me just feels like problem in my body. Or in the case of the White Noise series, it was problem about my body. And so I wanted to, I needed to find a way to be master of that language. So if I write it 100 times, it is now physically manifest in me. I'm rewriting it. And so it's mine. What starts off as problem, I'm now exerting some sort of control over. It lets me own the thing. And that part still feels important. The pain I want to let go of. Being master of the thing, I'm still really interested in.
Yeah. No, I find it to be so interesting because I'm like, when you're doing these works, are you doing them alone in your studio?
Yeah. I mean, in grad school, I had a studio mate, but headphones.
Yeah. Because I think that's actually so, because there's something in your work to me that's like, it's such a gift, right? Like when you kind of, what you're given in this kind of surface level, like the more that you kind of look and the more you peel back the layers, even before you like might read a wall text or might, look you up and figure out what you're interested in, there's just this kind of attention to giving, like it's generosity, like giving the viewer room to be able to like piece these elements together, right? In a way that's like, that might be so familiar. I teach at an art school and like, you teach artists, it's like, there's how many times have we had students come to us, like I just had a shitty critique, I had somebody kind of like who's like, your work's too didactic or your audience is too narrow, or, you fill in the blank. How, who's your audience? How are they going to access this work? And what I find so generous about what you give is like the actual phrases are phrases that are so like visceral. They speak to a kind of collectivity, right? Like there's this kind of like collective force where I remember one of the first times I started work, I just started laughing because it was like involuntary, because the pain's too much.
Yeah.
Like to your point. So you have to go somewhere else with it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so hearing that you kind of do this is a solo and like an investigation you tend to do on your own in the studio. I'm always kind of curious about like, what other voices are with you, or like how, like, what are you listening to? Is this like a deeply meditative process for you? Do you imagine the object that you're working with as another body in the space with you, like speaking back to you in this way, right? Like, yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I am repeating that phrase over and over again, and sometimes it kind of restarts. It doesn't always complete a sentence as I write. And so I'm attempting to obsessively meditate on that thing so that I can feel like I understand what was really being asked of me. It's like language behind language. Mm-hmm. Probably figure out a response, but I can't think about too much else or I'll start writing that. When I was at Studio Museum, Kevin was often playing music, and that would sometimes make its way into the work, and I'd have to like reset. I'm thinking about Too White to Be Black, not Kevin's work. Yeah, it filters in, and so it is a kind of way, it's an attempt to enter some sort of like meditative state. And when you get pulled out of that, the pain is kind of a pull out, having to leave the work and trying not to look at it, so that I'm not interested in its aesthetic qualities. I'm interested in solving the concept of the work, not the formal qualities as much. Those all become they become rules that feel really important to keep on track. Also feels like background. Yeah.
I have two follow-up.
Okay.
One is, have you ever had a work that like failed for you, or like a phrase that you just like couldn't work out, that you just maybe gave up on?
No, I've had some, there's always a moment when the form also has to be solved. That always doesn't happen as I want it to, which is, what is the word? Organically. There's also some phrases that I wish I had never done. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but it was like, oh, I just shouldn't have put that out into the world. That one was too much. I mean, they were true at the time, but they were really personal and it feels like too much. And so like language, I wish I could take back.
Yeah. And then I'm like, I'm like, okay, clocking that for the 8 o'clock. I'm like the post strength, but the other question that I had was, it didn't work out. Oh, you mentioned, and you also obviously do not have to answer this question, but you mentioned that, one of the kinds of questions of investigation was like entering the problem to like also create space for you to figure out what you should have said. Which to me is like another, as a Virgo rising, I really relate to that. Right? Which is like that moment that you're like, I had it. Like it was right there. And I like it's like the rage was like almost like too much to deal with the clarity that it did bring me in that moment, but I like maybe could not have like done it. So
Yeah.
I feel like this idea of entering the problem to get to like what you wish would have happened or what you should have done in that moment. And so I'm wondering if there are any like striking, like what should, what would you have said, right? Like if you could go back to your past self.
Yeah. I mean, I watch Housewives. I like to think that I am as like quick-witted as Portia, but I'm probably not that fast. It takes me a while. So there was one moment when I made a work in grad school again, and the critique that I got in response to the white noise piece was, well, aren't you afraid you're going to offend us? It's like, there is no way out of this problem. I'm not going to win this. I'm not going to win this fight, this verbal fight. And so I'll just keep making works about it. And so both the like, maybe you should make it into a slave ship becomes a work. And then when that offends the person who asked it, and they ask, aren't you afraid you're going to offend us? Like that becomes the work. It becomes this endless, an endless response. So there's always a response to it, though I don't have it in language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I think that like the way you've done it is like the best revenge, where it's like, it's just to me like the kind of like perfect way, like the perfect fuck you, right? Because suddenly what ends up happening is like that person becomes the type. Like you don't become the type, right? Like they become the type. There's this kind of like reverse, it's a way from what I see in this practice is this way of like combating the white supremacist terms of objectification that have been so overwhelmingly placed on Black people. It's a way of like turning that, right? A way of turning it such that like they become that type of white person, right? And that to me feels like, or I mean, maybe they're not all white, but it becomes like a way of actually kind of creating space and distance to engage another kind of attention, which kind of brings me to my like second question. I know I don't want to hog the space because I think other folks are probably as excited as I am. But I'm wondering if maybe you could share with us, some investigations that, or like some words or phrases or concepts that like you just like can't let go of. Like, are there any that any terms specifically that are lifelong relationships for you? That, because I know, what you've shared with us, the idea of like what it means to be a nation, right, is very much like at the forefront. And within that, there are all of these kinds of discourses that emerge. And I'm wondering if you have, any like any specific like words that are just like attached to you,
Yeah, I mean, they're yes, I think they're broad. I think I think it's something about faith, which there's a Teju Cole interview with Krista Tippett that he did a while ago, and he talks about like leaving the credo behind, the actual belief of his childhood behind, but still holding on to the rituals of that faith, that feels important. And also that a lot of that, like the need for a faith in something, that for Cole, he mentions that it's about wanting to, that we all need a lot of help. And where he finds that help is in the language, our language that has been boiled down to its most quintessential forms. So that's the language of our religious and spiritual traditions. It's in poetry and literature. It's in Homer. I was like, yes, it is in Homer. It is in the Odyssey, Teju. And that feels true to me. It's like, though I've left the actual belief, that system of belief behind, those rituals I actually keep coming back to, especially now, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, something to like hold on to and ground oneself in. So part of the hymnal, part of the reason for making it was, and the performances that came out of it, was that we used to do, I grew up in a really progressive Presbyterian church in Montgomery, Alabama. So very conservative place, very progressive church. And we used to do these 48-hour, I can't remember if it was 48 or 72 hours, I have no idea how long it took, but Bible readings. And so you'd sign up for your hour, midnight, 3 a.m., 5 p.m., whatever, and you would come and read from the pulpit. And you would hope that somebody who was on the list next was going to show up to relieve you from your post. And otherwise, if not, you just kept reading. Sometimes there were people in the pews. A lot of times it was empty. But there's something about that a text, a sacred or a secular text, because people do this with the Odyssey still too, that it's like worthy of being spoken back into the world, even if nobody is listening. And that feels like a faith in this right now, in this nation. So one of the first performances I did was actually like an open call. It's made me so uncomfortable talking about mastery and control. It was an open call. Anybody could come up and sing for 30 minutes from the hymnal, 100 versions. You can sing about 10 songs maximum in 30 minutes. And they would sing, I kind of built this chapel-like space in Miami, Locust Projects, filled it with this foyographic wallpaper that was about flowers of the South, kind of official state flowers of the South and their meanings. And then in the middle of that was the hymnal and the singing from the pulpit. There were some good singers and they were beautiful to listen to. It's a really, it takes about 4 hours to sing through the hymnal. So hour 2 and 3 are terrible. It gets stuck in your mind in a terrible way. And then the 4th hour, it comes back to you. But there was one singer who was horrible. And I think she did it on purpose. It made me deeply uncomfortable in the moment. It wasn't even the right melody. It made me so uncomfortable. But then looking back at it, that discomfort and also her failure to sing the song in a way, or to at least to make it beautiful, that actually feels like the best part of that piece, right? Because it doesn't always sound good. The hymnal, the more you read it, it's going to fall apart. Like if you turn the page, you are aiding in its destruction. To participate is really messy. So that felt like the good part. Why did I say that? Oh, because faith is something I'm still thinking about a lot, and ritual and repetition. And what does it mean to like love as faith as love?
Yeah. I mean, faith, that makes me kind of think about the other part of faith, which is like manifesting it.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something kind of so deeply like that attached in your work to me around like manifesting it, right? Like organizing a system for yourself that looks at systems in order to create this kind of like, a kind of collectivity in the work as well, right? Like not just an abstract one, but actually like a material one. Like, it's like thinking of somebody having your like spit on their wall, right? Is like, or like your fingerprint, right? That thing that's like uniquely yours. Not just like the idea being uniquely yours, but the kind of way that you are leaving parts of yourself quite literally like in these works. And even broadening that more like out even further to the kind of like idea. It's not just about like questioning the idea of collectivity, but actually like trying to kind of like be with each other in that kind of space is, it's like not romantic, but
no, it's not.
It's something.
Living in community is difficult. But I think part of the belief is also that it's going to fail. That feels important. That always when I'm like comparing translations or definitions, when the text won't like sit still so that we can understand it, there's something missing from, like there's a whole Birmingham News series where no civil rights stories are published on the cover pages, that there's something missing from the text, that it is bound to fail. And my love of language comes from its like potential and its inevitable failure. One without the other, I'm not interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're like, the attachment that we have to the words we use is so much, it's so grounded in all that like unconscious to like everything that you can't actually reach up to say, right? Which is why like the idea of reading the Bible for 48 hours, 72 hours is such a distinctive, it's such a distinctive way of an exercise of failure, right? Like the way that like, you kind of, your eyesight gets blurry, or like you skip over a word, or you mispronounce it, or your voice goes hoarse. I think, and there's versions of that, I think it's so interesting that like faith is such a guiding concept for you, because I think so many of us are afraid to admit, right? Like we may know not to believe in God, right? So we say like the universe will make it okay.
I mean, that's probably where I am too, but it is like, there is no escape from the religion of your childhood. Like, though I don't believe any longer, it's still all in there. Those rituals, hearing the Presbyterian version of the doxology, like still does it for me, right? Although I could skip the sermon because I'm probably not on the same page, but the rituals still feel necessary. They still tie you to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's why, I turned to art. Yeah. I mean, there is something kind of like about that's also present, right? Like this kind of exploration of like the deepest questions of existence, right? Or questions of like the nature of what it means to live. They manifest themselves in, these aesthetic choices and material choices you're making. That last series, especially, right? Like faith is something that gets us through loss. And in some of the most kind of, like the idea for me that you're engaging in this process of like blind embossing these works, and but they're like so deeply organized around like that touch, like that process of you actually like dipping these works and like trying to figure out methods to not make the fragility of the page, fall apart, only for it to get stronger. That's like having a certain kind of like faith in the material, like faith in the process, while you're also like literally trying to manifest people's like faith that they'll find their loved ones, right? Or faith that they're out there, and that we can rely on each other to find them. Like what's interesting to me about those works is that they're not like kind of like asking God, though people might be doing that too. There's a real like reliance on community, or reliance on strangers, people you don't know who can help you find one another. Yeah.
You said it. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to stop. I really should do my job now, which is like, I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions or comments for Bethany.
or either of us.
Yeah. I'm realizing I can't see everyone too. So if it on my little tiny screen, so if you have your hand up or something and you just want to jump in, that's welcome as well.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
So,
Hi.
you. Hi, Bethany. I was just reading an interview with Ernesto Pujol about, he talks about vulnerability as creative self-knowledge. And I'm wondering if, Bethany, if you can expand to see how vulnerability works itself into your work, because it seems like when you're trying to work through this exercise of owning the language, you're vulnerable. And also the paper and just having the wet paper and running it through through the press with the embossing. It's kind of playing with those ideas of not fragility, because fragility is fear, but vulnerability as, as strength, as, for instance, the aggressors. I'll read a quote that really expresses that sentiment better than I'm putting it. But one has to be willing to die many times in the opinion of the powerful, who misunderstand our goals and our reasons because they always underestimate our agency.
I can't say that I've thought about vulnerability in relationship to the work. I've actually thought about the fragility often of the work, which is twofold to me. It is both, it's like, how far can you press the paper before it completely falls apart? And what does that say about its fragility, but also its ability to hold the line? And especially in those blind embosses. The other work that I blind embossed before was the Birmingham News, where the editorial board in 1963 decided not to publish any civil rights stories on their cover pages. So they have stories of Sophia Loren being sick in bed. A reporter goes to the zoo and pets a snake, not the hundreds of children filling the jails during the children's marches, the police dogs and fire hoses used on peaceful protesters that filled other papers' front pages, multiple photographs above the fold. Birmingham News reports on all these other inconsequential things. That work is also blind embossed twice, and it falls apart too. They made that work after, who was that horrible lady, Kellyanne, in the previous administration, who was talking about alternative facts? That when you challenge the institution of truth, the authority of truth, that the second time you do that thing, it might not hold up the second time. And so that's another way of thinking about, a belief in the institution, a hope for the institution, but also a reckoning with the institution that has failed you before, right? That you can love something that has also previously gotten it terribly wrong. When I use spit on the Odyssey pieces or the Contronym pieces and erase, it is about mastery, but it is also about pushing that paper just to the point before it breaks through and then letting it be so it can in a way heal itself and be permanently set. That to me is about the fragility often of the paper, which has a reference to the body. It can hold, it can heal, it can fall apart. It has a temporal quality. But I also think a lot of those processes are not just about fragility, they're about desire too. The tactile quality of the work is, I want you to want to touch that thing, to physically understand it, and to be forbidden from it at the same time. I think a lot of those processes they include fragility, but they're also pointing in these other directions too. Did that answer your question, Terry?
Yes.
I'm just going to take a pause and see if there are others in the room before I jump in.
If not, I would love to know about the book that you're working on. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but
No.
okay.
Here we are. Yeah, no, I'm just in that headspace because it's due in 8 days. Not that I'm counting. Talk about faith. But I'm the book is looking at images of death and dying in the Black Power era and focuses on 3 murders between 68 and 69 and 71. 68 and 71, Bobby Hutton, Fred Hampton, George Jackson. So paper actually plays a huge part because I'm looking at materials that are like not considered to be kind of high art objects, whatever that even means. So print media and political posters are central. And so kind of thinking of the way that papers, paper kind of like is this material that's like at once deeply temporary, but also super lasting, right? Like that is also kind of like apparent in your work. And I see that we could probably talk about that forever. Like this strange moment where in the newspaper, the Birmingham News, or in my case, like the Black Panther Party newspaper, right? Like there's this way that like those objects are so a part of, were so a part of everyday life. But they were like never meant to survive. Like they're so cheaply made and cheaply, that's actually what contained within these materials, their kind of democratizing promise, like much like the photograph, like they were accessible at the level of economy, but they weren't like archivally, like intended to be kept, and they disintegrate and they fall apart and there's holes in them. And, so like when we're working in these ways, I'm sure you encounter this too, like artists are often the best historians because like, what it takes when you're like in the archive looking at these objects, the kind of engagement of the life of the object is like so deeply a part of the way that you think of how like how the material bounces back or is resilient or not, and like you said, like transfers itself into how we think about the body. I don't know if you experienced that when you were like doing research for that project specifically, but like this feeling of like, it's all I often think about early in the research for the book. I went to the African American Museum in Oakland, and they, like many Black institutions, are like totally underfunded, like unfunded. Like there's no like great, like they literally came out with a box and they were like, here you go. Like, I'm like, do you have any gloves, or you want me to use gloves or anything? And they're like, if you want, but you would be the first. Like, we don't have gloves. Do you have gloves? I mean, just this, but I like, there's something so deeply beautiful about that. Like hundreds of people have touched this thing.
Yeah.
You can be 101, like these are precious, but they're not precious. They're deeply meaningful and part of like our history and our life, but they're also like, they weren't intended to be thought of as these, lasting objects. They were intended to be used and circulated. And, that to me is what's so like the Odyssey. I think of like my copy of the Odyssey from junior high,
Which one was it? Do you remember which translation was it?
It was the Penguin one. It's like, it has like the golden, it was the Penguin Press one. It's like the golden mustard color cover that was like embossed.
Ooh.
Listen.
That sounds lovely. But there's also so much that you can, I do love an archive that will let you touch the thing, even though it's not good for the work. There's so much information in that, running that paper through your fingers, which is part of, the material choices often for the work as well. Pattern or Practice, which is the blind emboss of the Ferguson report, is on Somerset Radiant White paper. So it has a kind of Christmas to it. It's also blindingly white. You know, from a distance, it just looks like a wall of white paper. It reflects everything. And so it's really hard on the eyes. It also, though, has a very kind of fleshy, especially after you emboss it, feel to it, and it holds the embossed text really crisply, so that the entire report is legible, but it's also painful to read. And because it's like a braille, you want to touch it, but it's so, you know, clean and precise, and it's in a museum, you are forbidden from it. It's like all those paper choices, they matter, or they all speak.
Yeah. And the texture, like they change, you know, I'm thinking about like touching it and how that like actually changes the texture of like your fingertips, right? Because you know, that moment where this is the beauty of newsprint, like you used to touch it, and I remember as a kid, like you would just have ink all over your fingers.
Yeah.
Right. And my dad would always get like mad about the fact that like the front page was always like, because, you know, you're a kid, you're gross, like you're sticky, and you're like, fingers are always kind of like dewy and weird and gross. And so they would just, you know, like smudge something that he was like trying to read. But
reading it before, is that why?
It was like one of my jobs to like grab it and bring it in, you know, and it was always too early and the water would hit it. And it was this like, you know, bad at my job. But that idea that like the material changes, but you also change, right? Like your texture changes. It's not this kind of like unidirectional mode. Like I can imagine you've probably gotten many a paper cut.
Yeah. Yes. Also, I tear with spit, you know, that old school, like you crease it and then spit it instead of using I don't know what they're called when you put down the metal piece and tear. I like to do it myself. And so often like a tongue cut too. Yes. Also, you can't do any of that erasure after coffee. You have to do it all before coffee or it stains the paper. There are all kinds of ways in which that work is laborious. It's not the most fun pieces to make.
Yeah, I'm curious about it in a COVID landscape.
You mean like other people being uncomfortable?
No, like, I mean, just that it's charged with like a whole other set of meanings. Like it's even more taboo, I feel like now, you know, that like to have a piece of yours or to like encounter it is to have this other element of like danger, like, you know, wrapped and coded in the way that it is. Because we don't do that anymore.
I mean, you know, yes, there are some good things. There are some good things we don't do anymore.
I love the gift of God. We could just go on and on. Let me pause again to just like say, if anybody has anything, just please interrupt us because we will go on forever and ever. Oh, Denise, yeah.
Yeah. So another thread that I see that is so present in your work is how meaning and value of a text or a song is not really generated by the reader, or it's not generated just solely by the author, right? It's the reader who generates meaning out of the text that they're reading. So I'm really interested in if you could talk more about this relationship between deciphering something versus it deteriorating. Because you do that very much with the materials that you're using, especially materials that really rely on some bodily force, right? But also I'm thinking about the affect that you experience when doing the research, especially for information wanted. And maybe I'm speaking from a very personal perspective with regard to like my first time seeing those works. I saw them, I first encountered them at the High Museum in Atlanta. And I remember just reading very, very closely. Like they look like, oh, it's okay. They just look like pieces of paper that are just framed. But once you come closer to them, the more the information is revealed to you just by that really close looking. And the information that is embossed is quite emotional. So I would love to hear about this relationship between deciphering and deterioration, but also what kind of affects do you respond to when doing research for these works?
I think this gets back to actually something that we talked about, like, what am I looking for these days? And this idea of ritual, like a love of word or love of language. I am often looking for the poetry. So even in these, the classified ads are incredibly hard to read. They're really hard to read. You know, as it gets into the 1920s, you have lawyers posting with hoping to transfer wealth and estates down. But that's like very late. That's as far as we get from the actual moment of separation and loss and longing and looking. If you trace back closer to, you know, end of the Civil War, or even into the 1890s, there's a large collection of the ads from the 1890s after Reconstruction is sabotaged, fails, and it gets the worst for us nationally. Again, it is the worst for us in this moment, and we still go on looking for our loved ones. They're really painful to read. But I'm still looking for the poetry that helps us to make it through the language, that really painful language. The same is true for the Ferguson report, that there has to be something for us to hold on to so that we can make it through. And in the classified ads, it is that kind of choral repetition of asking that people would hear from the pulpits, ministers reading certain ads from the pulpit, and they would hear other people asking in this way. And so they would start to ask in the same way, or they would read the ads and the same thing would happen. They would post their own ad and ask the same question. So that those, you know, they're each individual love letters to a particular person that has been lost, but they also become a collective kind of chorus of asking for your loved ones. So do you know them? Have you seen her? I last saw her in Mississippi. Can you help me to find my people? Will the ministers of the South please read this from your pulpits? That chorus feels, that poetic kind of chorus feels important. I think this is getting at your question, that to make it through the text, which is often, even when it's not the most painful text, there's still some problem in the text, like the Odyssey. It's not a painful text. But the moment that I want to point to is actually really painful, when it feels like your own nation has betrayed you. And you feel like you should not have been surprised. You should have expected that moment. And that makes the betrayal that much more painful. That I'm still looking for the poetry. Like, tell me about the water. Was it whispering, or was it deaf, or was it tumultuous and deep voiced? Like those comparisons that we could have 10 different translations of just what the ocean, the water was doing at that moment. That feels like a way to have something to hold on to as the rest of the language like shifts around you, or the paper falls apart, or it becomes illegible, and hopefully frustrating, that there's still some part of it that grounds us. I'm also really interested in transferring a lot of that, you know, the paper falling apart, it being illegible. I want you, the viewer, to be frustrated by trying to make sense, because the language is difficult for me in the beginning. And by the end of the work, getting back to this idea of not letting pain be the impetus for the piece, or the motivator and the goal of the work, that if I can transfer frustration onto you, I feel like I have done my job. Or in the singing pieces, that I no longer have to be the body that makes this piece, that language can be read by you and sung by you, like it becomes transformed in the body and comes out completely different. It doesn't even have to be mine anymore. I'm interested in that moment too. Did that get your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Any other questions, or should I have one final one but we have time.
I think Evan has a question.
Great, Evan. Hi, Evan.
It's nice to see you. Something I started thinking a lot about, especially after Dennis's question, is something you said before, where it was the language that kind of is behind the language, and this kind of like I know it's like, I mean, that's kind of translation, right? Is like, it's finding all of those languages behind the languages, you know, and all of those things that sit behind the language. I started thinking about a lot of what Moten writes about in Blackness and Nothingness about Pidgin, especially in regard to Fanon's work, and like how there are all of these like multifaceted elements that sit behind, you know, all of these different kinds of languages. And then also what sits behind the languages in general, like, you know, sort of like the sadness that's like behind the language of like searching for family is there, but like behind that language is also all of these elements of like, that we'll never know, but of like the family being found, right? And like, there's like kind of these like narratives of like both hope and joy and sadness and, you know, like kind of deep horrors and, you know, all element of like prejudice. And I'm wondering, like, you know, like for you, like in those like moments where all of those kinds of things kind of come up, like do you think about all of those like languages sitting behind the languages, like while you're working on these things, or like they're these ones that you're kind of trying to grasp at and like grab, or, you know, is it really kind of what was brought up earlier, like that kind of like, you know, it really is up to the like viewer to complete in these kinds of different ways, which I mean, with language, when conversation is us like kind of completing language works all the time, you know, it's like this kind of silent conversation, but I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. Yeah, there's all these things behind language. Can I give you an anecdote before I maybe respond to that question?
That would be most helpful, probably.
So, as I like Real Housewives, because I like other people's drama, I also like dictionary drama. So 1982 is American Hair. Yes. Oh, other people do too. I'm in my right group here. So 82, I think it's 82 is the first year that American Heritage Dictionary opens up their contributors board, so that it's not just linguists and staff members, it's also all these folks that they've just invited because I think they will be interesting contributors to the language as we make these really important decisions about what new words are added to the text. I don't think they removed any, maybe that's Oxford that doesn't remove. And also, how do we give context to these words as well, especially the new words. So 82, Dr. Angelou is now on the board, Antonin Scalia, Carl Sagan. The one that caught the most heat was a New Yorker cartoonist. And Rita was like, why? He's a cartoonist. He barely has language. And their response was, well, he has the most efficient use of language possible. He does like just what's needed and nothing else. Dictionary drama. But what's also interesting about that year, because I read the entire volume, the 1982, is that it turns towards violence in a really interesting way. So find, for instance, FIND, you could give any kind of illustrative sentences. I found my keys. Great. Instead, the illustrative sentences are the jury will find for the defendant, the liar will be found out, the burglar will be brought and caught to justice, find what's in there somewhere. Over and over again throughout the text, it's like a leaning towards violence that is not necessary, but because it's American Heritage Dictionary and because it's an 80s text, our dictionary from the 80s, American Heritage, like all of that feels like it's, oh, the text is trying to tell us something about this moment. That the dictionary also, like the Odyssey, is not settled law. And so it's always revealing our biases. There's always something behind the text. The same is true for the Odyssey. I think Emily Wilson also mentions the chapters that refer to the women in Penelope's household. She often describes them as slaves in her household because they have no agency. But the men before her have described them as whores and sluts and anything but, right? Sometimes maids, that's the nicest that it gets. According to Wilson, that's not in the Greek. Like that doesn't have to be the way we translate how we describe the women in that household. we reveal our biases. And it also feels important a lot of times in the Odyssey to include the year of which the translation comes from, because we're so different. I mean, in some ways we like keep repeating our mistakes of the past, but we're also, it's like something about American heritage from the 80s. What does that tell us that we're leaning towards violence in that decade, or at least in our language, and we lean towards violence. So we always betray ourselves. That was my anecdote. Would you remind me of the question part of your?
Yeah, I mean that kind of starts to get at it, especially, but that kind of like idea of like, so like the language that sits behind the language, and there are all of these different ways that, or there are all of these different languages, like the 60 translations of the Odyssey, you know, there are all of those stories of hope and sadness and joy and sorrow and violence, and you know, how you kind of like work through those things and also find, you know, what direction to go to, you know, when dealing with the language itself. You know, it's like there's always like a kind of, not a decision, but all of the decisions that get made right before it, you know, hits the gallery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like with the Ferguson report piece, part of that work is that it's painful. Part of it is that it is also a really wonderful truth-telling document. That's also really hard to read, but it encapsulates a lot of the truth of what led up to Michael Brown's death, murder, and also what led up to like the city falling apart and like, how did we get here? It traces all the steps and it lays out exactly what led to a moment in a way that is that feels like a dictionary. Like, can you tell me everything about the world in one document? So I think both of those things are behind, let's say, that piece, that I want you to feel like in order to understand this, it has to be physical for you. You have to live it. That desire to touch is part of the work. But also, it's also a beautiful document in that it tells a lot of the truth. Those feel a little bit oppositional, or like they're coming from two extremes, two poles. But I think they're both in the work, and the choice then of the white, crisp white paper that's hard on your eyes, but also is alluring and seductive, that it like sits right at that line. I think the material and the process, it has to say both of the things that's behind the work. Yes. That's a good question.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, I'll ask my final question, which is kind of related to this idea of what's behind the work. And so it's a question that I've recently kind of been obsessed with asking artists, which is, you know, when you, when we look at your work, we see, you know, this kind of rich, dynamic visual vocabulary that draws from, you know, minimalism and conceptualism, and with these kind of deep investigations in the question of language and meaning. And I'm curious about what influences we don't readily see in your work. Like, who's there that maybe we don't necessarily, who's there who's maybe a little bit more illegible for us?
Okay. I can tell, maybe by way of answering this, the artist that I envy is like two categories. One is the artist who, and so it's like, oh, I'm kind of striving to be this way, and yet I realize I envy you because I cannot be this way. One is artists who could work through the pandemic and they were really productive in that moment. I had a lot of envy for those artists and for their practices to be able to respond in the moment to something. Like, it's taken me, are we almost 2 years? It's taken me this long to feel like I have new ideas and I want to be back in the studio. That's 2 years. And then the other is, I envy artists who don't have to use language, and yet it feels like there's something linguistic there. So, you know, like Agnes Martin, Cy Twombly, they're not beholden to language. It's like they've transcended the necessity of it, like loosed themselves from that thing. But it's still something about the essence and the poetry of language is still embodied in their work. Yes, I have revealed all my envies.
Thank you so much, Bethany.
Thank
You've been
you.
so generous and kind of gifted us with so much. And I'm so grateful. Thank you to Denny for convening us in Gallery 400. I'll toss it back to you, Denny, if there's any kind of closing words.
My closing words are, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Bethany, for such an amazing hour and a half of talking about your work. Thank you again for allowing us to have this generative conversation. For those who are still here, please come to our gallery, Gallery 400, at UIC to check out our current exhibition, Young, Gifted, and Black, which features many intergenerational artists. And that's it for the night. Thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you all have a great weekend and a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.